2022 following this flight on the number of meals we're buying, which does significantly reduce the cost overall for the catering that's provided on an aircraft.
Thank you, General. We'll now go to Mr. Johns for 6 minutes.
See all my colleagues. I hope you had a wonderful summer. It's nice to be on the back on the unceded lands of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin people, and I want to thank our guests for being here today and for your service. I also want to thank Ms. Vignola for putting forward this motion, which we strongly supported. We've seen the rising cost of living that many Canadians are struggling, to make ends meet. Food costs are going up. We've just seen 41-year high in inflation, 10.8% in food costs. Against this backdrop, sorry, I can't hear myself. If I could, it's understandable why many Canadians were concerned. They're not concerned; they're actually outraged when they hear about the in-flight catering expenses here on this trip for the Governor General's March 2022 visit and tour of the Middle East, and the shockingly high cost, the $218 a meal is just, it's unacceptable. And I've had a number of constituents write to me today about this issue, and I really hope that we can get further transparency and some changes actually today. And so, maybe I'll start with you, Commander Kenny, and again, congratulations on your promotion. Really grateful again for your service. Maybe you can talk about, is a budget for in-flight catering expenses established in advance on trips on Airbus and Challenger flights? And if so, can you talk about what the budget was for the Governor General's March 22 tour of the Middle East?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do not have a set budget for a specific flight. We are provided operations and maintenance funding throughout the year to cover VVIP travel, but we don't specifically have funds allocated for each flight.
Can you talk about what checks and balances are in place for when in-flight catering expenses are beyond the norm, or what's been budgeted? I guess I'm concerned that if information regarding the catering costs for this trip hadn't been made public because of an order paper questioned by Mr. Barrett, we wouldn't even be having this conversation about the appropriateness of these expenses or how to improve practices moving forward.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So right now this is coordinated between the flight steward lead on the particular flight, working with Global Affairs Canada protocol to determine the menu set and actually do the catering. We are absolutely committed to changing this to make sure that it reflects the expectations of Canadians and those that we're serving on our flights. And I strongly believe that we will be able to further reduce costs as we move forward. Okay,
that's really good to hear. My next question is actually, has there been a thorough review of the catering expenses from this trip? And maybe what areas have you identified where expenses could have been reduced, and if so, where were those possible savings and where were they identified?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So one of the savings that was identified is in terms of the contingency meals that are purchased for the flight, which is above and beyond the total number of people on the flight. So reducing that specifically is one of the savings that has been implemented. There is also certain locations that we know are much more expensive than others. Having said that we were told, working with Global Affairs Canada, exactly what locations we're going to, and I would allow my colleague to speak to why they would pick certain locations.
If the chair would allow, I'm happy to jump in and add a little bit of detail there on the question of selection of locations. Often when we are traveling as the guest to a host nation, will be dictated what airport we need to land in, and in consultation with public safety and other partners here in Ottawa, we and the Air Force, of course, we identify a flight routing, and there may be some limitations on countries in which or places in which we can land to refuel, for example. So that explains a little bit the limitations sometimes on which airports. But I think what's really important is our members of our teams have been working together since this episode, and we recognize that there are problematic elements of this process. And what we're trying to do now is instill a no-nonsense environment where if there are exorbitant costs, they need to be flagged. They need to be flagged at the appropriate moment so we can make alternate choices or forego things that might have been part of the standard operating elements that that have always been included in packages. And we're happy to make those choices, and we look forward to being able to deliver cost savings.
I guess what I'm looking for is, what changes and practices have actually been implemented since March 2022, and to ensure that there's responsible stewardship of public funds and ways to improve accountability so that it doesn't require an order paper question, so that Canadians know what expenses are being done, what changes are being done, what is going to be moving forward, the transparency to Canadians to help them see that this isn't going to happen again.
Well, I would just mention again that we are identifying cost savings. One of the examples that the General gave was this idea of contingencies. And to help people understand, it's the standard operating procedure when you're on an international commercial flight is that you'd be given a choice between two meals, chicken or fish. Would you like chicken or fish? And ordering enough meals to make sure that you've got a balance of those and you allow that choice is an art. It's an art that the caterers and the steward work through in order to have a balance between service and overage or waste. As the General mentioned, the number of contingency meals that had been ordered in the past have been strictly reduced over the last few years. We've now decided, as one of the outcomes of the discussions that we've undertaken since this became clear to us, is to forego choice altogether. So on the recent trip to London, there were no choices, and that reduces the number that we have to order because everybody's eating the same. So that's one, obviously not dietary restrictions. We still, but we were able to identify those things in advance and make sure that we've got a robust system of checks and flags so that we're able to work together and avoid these exorbitant costs.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler, and thank you, Mr. Johns. We'll now go to the second round, and starting with Mr. McCauley, 5 minutes.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just very quickly, some of the committee members have asked for copies of the menus and that. There would have been provided a banquet event order or a catering event order for that. Can you confirm, please, that you'll provide that to this committee as soon as possible, please, for this flight or for this issue? Thank you. What was the reason behind the difference between the 93,000 in the order paper question and the revision?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair, and it's a great question. So initially, when we responded to the order paper question, the cost that came out was $93,117.89. What we didn't specify, which we should have, was based on an estimate, based on what we understood at the time from the catering companies to be the cost. When we received the invoices.
So when we get these banquet event orders, are they going to reflect 93,000?
No, so each location, each caterer that we worked with had a cost. Okay. We had estimates.
Would you provide us with the estimates then and the final bill and the menus, please, to the committee?
Perfect. Once we looked through it and we got the final invoices, the total cost turned out to be 80,000.
Will you provide us, please, with those estimates, the contracts, and the menus, please, for all the flights in question?
We'll take it on in order to look into those, providing what we have for you.
I'm not asking you to look into it. Will you provide it for us, please?
We'll take it to look at, or to provide.
I think I have the will of the committee to ask that you provide it for us. Are there any other, perhaps, hidden costs that haven't been part of that 80,000 that you've discovered later or haven't been included in that 80,000? Or is that the drop-dead final cost? There's nothing else?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. It's a great question. So there's additional costs beyond catering for our flights. Specifically, there's costs for airport taxes, administrative fees, security charges, and local taxes.
Specifically regarding the fuel or the catering for that flight?
When we go to certain thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. When we go to certain airports, there's charges for landing fees, airport taxes that are not
to the catering or the
no,
fuel.
They're separate from the catering charges.
Okay, so there's no other charges that are going to pop up.
So the charges of $80,367 for the catering costs hold, which was a further update that we gave in June, not part of the original order paper question. But there is additional cost beyond that, just to be clear, outside of catering
Okay.
that we have.
Okay. What was the cost per person for the recent trip that the Prime Minister and the GG took to London and then to New York?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I do not know what the cost was
Would you
per
provide
person.
that for us and the contracts and the menus? When you talk about a selection of chicken and beef, I know on Air Canada you have a choice of stringy chicken or stringy tasteless chicken. Often it's the same item. Is it beef, or are you offering a fillet, a choice cut of beef? Like what is exactly being chosen? Because the reason I ask, I'm kind of gobsmacked, and I'm trying to be polite here, but I'm gobsmacked that it's 2022. There's dozens of people, I'm sure, working on this. That $218 just seems to be, yeah, that's okay. I get asked, how did this happen? I mean, we hear Mr. Lieutenant General Kenny talking about changing things in 2019, addressing the contingency in 2019, unless I heard that wrong. But now it's 2022, and we're hearing, well, we're going to address the contingency. I don't have a lot of faith. We keep hearing, well, we're reviewing. We've been reviewing for years. I don't have a lot of faith that, and Mr. Johns was getting at it, that it's actually going to get done. We hear a lot of reviewing. Would you be able to maybe put in writing to this committee actual firm steps you're taking to address the costs?
Absolutely. I think to answer your question around the style of meals, standard commercial airline practice meals is what we're ordering, in line with health and safety and travel regulations, as the general mentioned. But we are looking at concrete savings, and we'd be happy to make that available to the committee.
40 seconds. Oh, 40 seconds. The previous week to the GG's trip to the Middle East, the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and 58 other people went on a trip to London, Poland, various stops, 8 stops, 60 people, and the cost was about 2/3. So we had about 50% more traveling, and yet 2/3 less cost for that trip for catering. Like, how do we end up with such a massive discrepancy between caring for the Prime Minister? So it's not like it's 60 members of OGGO. This, we're talking top echelon people. Like, how do we end up with such a massive difference? And,
So thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I don't have the specifics of those costs with me.
it's on the same order paper. Maybe you can let us know.
What I can say is where we go to really dictates the price. So, for example, Qatar, UAE, the catering costs are quite high. And there's certain locations.
I think we're out, but I'll come back the next time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And if there's further documentation that you'd like to provide, if you provide that to the clerk, and the clerk will distribute that amongst the committee members, greatly appreciated. Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Baines for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our guests for joining us today. My question is to Mr. Wheeler. Earlier, the Lieutenant General Kenny mentioned things like monopolies in certain countries that drive up the cost. Were there other unique or unusual restrictions or limitations that contributed to the cost of catering services in this situation?
I think on this flight on this visit there were a number of complexities given the number of countries, the number of stops, and we would have to go back and look at the specific airports. But I can say that that the discussions with host countries, and in this case the host countries that we visited, did have a an impact on which airports that were chosen for our landings in the host countries, and that related to, for example, in the UAE, landing with a government aircraft at a time when the UAE was hosting the final month of the World Expo. The UAE government requested that we land at a specific government aircraft or government airport versus the main commercial one, which is often the case when we're flying government aircraft into host countries for a hosted event by a foreign country.
So is like a government airport versus a commercial airport, are the costs different? Like a government airport, the landing fees are more than like a commercial one?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So different in each situation, but often these are locations where there's very limited catering services. In other words, there might only be one caterer available to us. And they don't, they're not used to working with airlines as we would see in a more normal civilian airport, where the cost could be lower because they have a greater quantity that they're providing. So the location is selected by GAC in coordination with the host country, of course, for those reasons to include security. But ultimately, what's available there is often, there's less choice when it comes to the actual caterers that are available to us.
Okay, moving on to how does the GAC protocol determine the appropriate standards that in-flight catering should meet? For instance, if we have Royal VVIP persons that are flying on RCAF aircraft, how would GAC determine the appropriate standards?
We work with the Air Force to request a meal plan that is in line with the health and safety travel regulations, how long the flight is, how many meals would be offered, as I mentioned, and meals are arranged aligned with standard commercial airline practices for flights of the same duration. Global Affairs Protocol is not involved in visits of the royal family to Canada. We are involved only with foreign dignitaries, and of course the royal family is the Canadian royal family. So that's not one where we would be involved. The Department of Canadian Heritage coordinates the royal tours. But I think the important thing is that we work very closely with the Royal Canadian Air Force to determine what is the appropriate number of meals, what kinds of meals do we need, how do they complement the program that we have, or are they in line with the program that we have, and then we review those and confirm the final menus based on the selections which have been able to be had from catering companies.
Okay, so what is the GAC protocol office's role in this process then? How do they act between an RCAF, a VVIP office to determine catering choices? Where does that directive sort of come from?
As I mentioned earlier, our job is to work with our partners, whether it be the Governor General's Office, the Royal Canadian Air Force, to ensure that there are appropriate meals provided during the visit. As I mentioned before, our job is not to task, but to share information. We evaluate the menu plan. We look at the options that are being put forward. We make sure that still fits with the needs of the people that are flying in terms of special meals, etc. And in this case, for example, I would say it's useful to know perhaps that the Office of Protocol at no time in the process does the Governor-General herself personally review menus. The only review by the Office of the Secretary of the Governor-General for menus for her flights is actually done as a point of information and in order to avail ourselves of the free in-house or the in-house translation expertise that Rideau Hall has when it comes to food, so that we can meet our obligations under the Official Languages Act to present a bilingual menu to our passengers. But that consultation with the Office of the Governor-General is for information purposes. It's the Office of Protocol that makes the choices on for menu selections in conjunction with the Air Force and the options that are provided by the catering companies.
Thank you, Mr. Baines. And now we